In this Elden Ring Nightreign video, I'm going to be talking about the Scholar Nightfarer, one of the 2 new Nightfarers added to the game. I'm going to be going through tips. We're going to be going through his stats, his skills, what they do. We're going to be talking about Bagcraft, how that works. We're going to be talking about Analyze, how that works. We're going to be talking about what are some good relics for him. He has some very good class relics. Some other ones are not so good. What weapons to use, and just some generally good tips for him. So if you've been having trouble with Scholar and you want to know what I'm doing, what's been working for me, you can watch on for some helpful information. So talking a little bit about the Scholar is very much a support character. It's a character that buffs allies, that debuffs enemies. It can heal and debuff enemies as well with its ultimate, and it can also make use of items more effectively than some other classes. So if you have a relic that confers those bonuses to your allies, then you can passively buff them with consumables over and over amongst these things. And you spend a good amount of your gameplay doing these things compared to just attacking like some other classes, which is why this is a support class. Now, if you take a look at Scholar's stats, he has pretty mediocre stats in just about everything other than Arcane, which means that he can't really spell cast all that well. He doesn't have as much melee damage as some other classes, but what he does have with that S in Arcane is a way to build up status effects very, very fast. And indeed, you'll notice when you're playing Scholar with some very specific weapons in the game, you can trigger blood loss in like 1 or 2 swings in some cases, and you can build up Scarlet Rot or Poison in 1 or 2 swings as well. So he's very, very good at applying statuses. It can be very challenging when you're fighting against enemies or bosses that are immune to many status effects, which is a reason that it's good to carry multiple weapons with different status effects, so maybe one of those statuses can apply or another one. So make sure you're doing that when you're playing Scholar. But basically, when your damage contribution to the group is going to be via status effects, mostly, and then the rest of the time you're going to be buffing allies and debuffing enemies. And one of the things that's really tricky about playing Scholar is that he has relatively mid stamina and HP. So if you're going in to do melee attacks, you can get one shot more easily than some other melee classes. You aren't going to be able to attack as many times in a row before you run out of stamina, so you have to be careful. And again, your FP is also mid, so you're not going to have a lot of FP to use a ton of weapon skills or cast spells, even though you have terrible spell casting stats anyway, so you would do very little damage when casting spells. Now, his dodge is also really, really bad, and this is another reason that it makes it very difficult for him to melee, and you might want to consider either using ranged consumables more, or something like the Wraith Calling Bell, or one of those types of consumable items, or maybe even a bow to stay out of melee range when you're not doing status effects. You absolutely want to do status effects, so I wouldn't recommend just only using those and never applying status effects, or you're only getting a bit out of this class and not everything. But his dodge is very weak. It looks like Recluse's dodge when you first see it, but it doesn't go hardly the distance, and in my estimation, it actually goes about 80% of the distance, maybe 75% of the distance of a normal dodge roll of somebody like Wilder or something like that. So you actually have a really bad dodge. So when you get up in melee range, you don't have a ton of defensive capabilities. You can use your character skill from time to time, but it takes a second to charge. You can't use it immediately. So you definitely don't want to have aggro and melee range any more than you need to. Okay, so let's move on to his character skills. We'll talk about Bagcraft first. What this does is it allows him to store 2 times the amount of consumables in each slot. So if you have 4 slots, you can normally hold 2 of something or 1 of something. You'll be able to hold 4 of it or 2 of it instead. So basically, he can hold the same amount of different types of consumables, but he can double the amount he can hold of those, which is great. And he additionally makes it so he actually levels up consumables as he uses them. Now, there are different groupings of consumables, so like they're not all the same. It doesn't translate perfectly. Like if you use a turtleneck, for instance, it doesn't level up your throwing pot damage. You have to throw pots in order to level up your throwing pot damage. But there are subsections of groups like buffs and grease and throwing pots that the more you use those, the more effective they will be. And there are some really, really strong effects from some of these when you get to level 3, which is why it's usually good to level these up as you play. And it's really simple. When you're playing Scholar, you're just going to run around, and when you see boxes, break them, pick up anything, make sure your allies are calling them out for them, pick them up, use them. Even if like you don't need the effect immediately, sometimes it's better to just use them and level it up so that it's strong for like the boss fights later on. And when I said there are some strong buffs as well, for instance, like Boiling Crab gives you actually 30% max HP at level 3 when you use it on top of the physical damage reduction that you get from it. And when you have a relic that allows your items to apply to your teammates, you can give them the physical damage reduction and the 30% max HP. So this is a very strong thing to do. And I would strongly recommend that when you get to the Night Lord, right, when you're before him in the Merchant, if you haven't gotten to level 3 with this subsection of like buffs, that you have your teammates buy you turtlenecks and crab. That way you can pop some real quick and level up to 3 and get your guys' health up in the fight. That will make things go better. But if you see merchants along the way, you should absolutely be buying consumables when you run into a merchant. I wouldn't say go out of your way to do it, but if it's like not far off the path from where you are, spend any extra money you have buying consumables in order to help level up your consumable level. And as I mentioned a second ago, Wraith Calling Bell can be really good, or some of the Omen Barons as well, because you can just spend your FP, which you don't typically use a lot of anyway when you're playing Scholar, to have a ranged attack that tracks the enemy. And this can give you some way of contributing damage when it's not safe for you to get in melee range, or maybe you've already applied like Scarlet Rot or Poison, and you don't have any reason to be in melee range anymore because you're risking death, and that's bad for your team. You can generate damage that way. So these are also really good to have. You can consider starting with the Wraith Calling Bell with a relic, or, you know, finding one along the way. Something else worth mentioning is that you can get a small pouch relic in order to have a 5th consumable slot, or you can buy a 5th consumable slot from a merchant when you see one, so you can hold more stuff. This is very good to have on a Scholar. And if you want to see a full list of like all the things that these different consumables do at their different levels, you can check that out on the wiki. We are working on that list currently. I don't know if it's 100% completely done yet, but there's a lot of data on there. I won't go through all of it in this video because there's too much to cover. So next we'll talk about Scholar's Analyze skill, which is his character skill. And this is a very interesting skill. It's probably what makes Scholar so good, in my opinion. And if you're playing Scholar correctly, in my estimation, you'll be using this skill every single time it's off cooldown, which means that you're going to stand there and either buff your teammates or stand there and debuff the enemy for a few seconds every time it's off cooldown, which is about every 10 seconds. So this isn't going to be a playstyle that everyone loves to do. If you're someone who wants to just run in and go ham melee or hang back and range spell cast, this is not the class for you, because you're going to be using this skill every time it's off cooldown. And in fact, if you can increase your character skill cooldown via relics or passive dormant powers, you absolutely should, because the more you can use this, the less damage bosses are going to do and the stronger your team is going to be. So absolutely make sure that you are using this skill regularly. So the way this skill works is that when you use the skill, you're going to have a reticle on your screen, and you're going to have these sort of circles that are over each enemy and a separate looking circle over your allies. And it's going to start filling up. And that the speed at which it fills up is not only determined by how far you are from the target, but from my understanding, it's also supposed to be based on how many enemies or allies combined there are on your screen. I have noticed that it does seem to build faster sometimes when there are lots of enemies on the screen, and sometimes it just seems to be about the same. But the distance is extremely noticeable. The further you get from the target, the longer it's going to take. Sometimes it can take like 30 seconds if you're really, really far away. So you don't want to be so far away when you do this. Otherwise, you're going to be standing there doing nothing for a very long time, if you can even pull it off. And there are several things you can do with this skill at this point, and that gives you a lot of agency when playing Scholar. And a big part of playing Scholar is using this skill effectively, knowing when and what to do. But predominantly, you're going to do either A, you're going to debuff the enemy, or B, you're going to buff yourself and your allies. So if you decide to debuff enemies, you're going to be pressing L2, and if you press L2 immediately when this character skill comes up, you will debuff enemies for a weaker damage reduction. This means that they will do less damage to allies for about 20 or 30 seconds, but not as much as if you let it get to tier 2, which is over 50% of the dial filled up. If you do that, it will do even more damage reduction. It's about double the effect of tier 1 in my estimation, and this will prevent your allies even further from taking damage. And if you let the dial fill all the way, then you will not only get the damage reduction from tier 2, but you will also make it so that the next hit those enemies take, if the dial is full on all of them, it's only full on one, it will only apply to that one. It'll make it so that the damage that enemy takes will be 50% more on the next hit they take. Now, on paper, that sounds really, really strong, but in practice, a lot of times, your allies are going ham on the enemies. They don't notice this is happening, and they just hit with like a regular R1 attack, and it's not nearly as much damage as it could be. It's still nice to have, but realistically, getting that tier 2 damage debuff is far more important than getting the extra damage on a hit most of the time. So when you're debuffing enemies, if you don't have a lot of time, consider just getting it to 50% on, if there are multiple ones on them, and then stopping and hitting L2 rather than, going the full way on the dot. Now, if you plan on buffing yourself or buffing yourself and your allies instead of debuffing the enemy, you're going to press R2 at some point instead of L2. And what this does for you is if you use it quickly below 50% of the dial on the enemy, you'll gain max stamina. And if you wait for it to be over 50%, you'll gain even more max stamina. And if you wait for the dial to be completely full, you'll actually put a small shield around you that lasts about a second after you do it, where if an enemy strikes you during that period, it'll actually like knock them backwards and deal damage, which is very, very strong. The hard part is that it's very difficult to time this properly when you're under pressure. So you almost have to wait for an enemy to attack you, know that they're coming at you and prep this ahead of time. And it can be kind of difficult to use, but it's very, very strong. Highly recommend getting in the habit of using that parry. We'll call it a parry, for lack of a better word, when you need it. Now, if you have an enemy in front of you and an ally in front of you on the screen, and you go to buff yourself with R2, you'll actually buff your ally simultaneously. But in this case, they won't get max stamina. They'll actually get damage resistance. And there are 2 tiers of this, just like the other thing. So if you want to give them more damage resistance, you would wait for the circle to be above 50% filled before using it. And if you're in a hurry, you can do it for lesser at tier 1. But ideally, you'd be at least tier 2 or higher. And keep in mind, if you hover over an ally with a reticle, but there's no enemy in front of you, you're only going to be able to get tier 1. And sometimes this, you just might want to buff an ally real quick with something. So you can do that in that instance, but you're only going to be able to get to tier 2 if you have that red circle filling on an enemy. And a couple other things about Analyze before we move on to the ultimate art. If you are mid-analysis on enemies and you decide to dodge an attack because it's coming straight at you and you don't want to get hit, it will actually kind of save the progress that you have on the enemies, but it will start slowly draining. So you won't start from 0 if you pop it back up immediately, but you will lose some progress. So in an ideal world, if you could just dodge a couple attacks and then get back into analysis quickly, you should be able to finish it more quickly than if you just started from scratch again 5-6 seconds later. So make sure that you do that. There is a relic that I believe slows the rate at which that drains if you interrupt that action, so that when you restart it again, you don't have to go as much. I haven't noticed it to be super effective though. Additionally, there's a very, very strong relic that also makes it so Analyze will not only give damage reduction to your allies when you use it on them, but it will also give them attack power increase. This is really, really strong. I consider it probably a must-have relic on any serious scholar, because buffing your team for damage reduction and attack power simultaneously over and over can be really huge for your team. Okay, moving on to Communion, which is the ultimate art of Scholar, and what this does is it links you and all enemies and your allies together, and it has a really, really big range when you use it. It takes a very long time to charge, in my opinion, but it's totally worth it. And what this does is it makes it so damaging enemies will heal teammates and yourself, and also damage other enemies simultaneously. And this is a great way to take down big groups of enemies, like an encampment or some other point of interest where there are lots of enemies and a boss. You can just start wailing on everything, and then suddenly everything's dead, and you're healing yourself simultaneously and your allies, which is good. Note that healing is shared across the group, so if you heal, your allies will also get healed, or if they heal, you'll get healed. And note that also if you drink a flask while you have missing health, if you're at full health, this doesn't work. But if you're missing health and you drink a flask while this is active, you'll actually deal damage to enemies as well. So it's very, very effective at wiping out groups of enemies. And there's a great relic in this game that makes it so this ultimate deals damage over time as well. It's really strong in my opinion. It helps wipe out packs of enemies even faster. Almost a must-have. Not completely a must for Scholar, but I think it's probably almost a must. And this damage also heals you and your group at the same time as well, which is really, really strong. And if you have a relic that makes it so when you defeat enemies, you gain ultimate art gauge, it's like 5% per enemy defeated. Works really well with this ultimate, because you cast it, it starts charging again, and then you defeat all these enemies, and you're like 2/3 or half the way back up to full again. So you can use this to wipe out encampments really easily, particularly if you have that relic. If you're playing single boss fights, which the DLC has some bosses with multiple bosses that works better on, but if you're playing like a single boss, end of day boss, Night Lord, etc., this is not as useful as it is in multiple enemy fights. It's not going to be as big of a shining star in those instances. It's much better at making your day 1 and day 2 runs go faster, so you get more XP, you get more loot, and you're higher level for the end boss, aka better prepared. So that's what you really gain from this ultimate. But when you use it in a solo boss fight, predominantly what you're going to use it for is to get some healing onto your allies. You can use it to help Undertaker trigger their, reusing of their ultimate so they can use it again. And also you can help like pick up downed allies with it. It doesn't pick up downed allies directly, but if you like attack a boss while this is up, it will help revive your ally a little bit. It's not really, I wouldn't count on it for a revive. It's definitely not one that I would, almost every other one out there, every other ultimate is almost better at reviving this, but it can absolutely help in a pinch. So moving on to weapons for the Scholar. Scholars use thrusting swords more effectively than other weapons with their own unique moveset, and there's some great thrusting swords in the game, but I would just say that status effects are more important than thrusting swords because of the high arcane of the Scholar, because again, you can trigger some statuses in like 1 or 2 swings depending on the weapon that you have. So even though thrusting swords I would recommend getting, I wouldn't prioritize it over something with a status effect. It's like status effect, thrusting sword, and in an ideal world, you'd have a thrusting sword with status effects. Some great weapons for Scholar are the Anspur Rapier. This is like such a staple. If you can get one with poison on it, you can put both on simultaneously, or bleed or cold. Duo status effects with a single swing is really, really nice. Reduvia and Rivers of Blood are good for bleeding. Scavenger's Curve Sword is good for bleeding, and maybe a duo status effect. Anything that comes native with bleeding on it that could have a potential second status effect, like claws, or any, like a katana, any types of katana are really, really good. And basically, you just want to have a variety of different weapons with different status effects in case there are immunities, and absolutely want to make sure you have at least one weapon with rot for tough boss fights, end-of-day bosses. Even if it's like a Great Axe or Battle Hammer, it doesn't really matter as long as it can apply a status effect, just so you can get that status effect on and then back away and continue your buffing and debuffing. So relics to look out for, I've mentioned a few already in this video, so make sure you look out for those ones. But ones that I like besides those are anything with character skill cooldown, so you can use Analyze a lot more often, is really strong. Anything that increases your ultimate art gauge is good for being able to use that ultimate more frequently. I like that. More health isn't bad. You start kind of mid on health and you will be meleeing from time to time, so that can prevent you from dying or getting one shot. Probably not super useful if you're doing like Deep of Night or something like that, but if you're just doing like regular game mode or early Deep of Night, it would be good. Additionally, there is a Deep of Night relic that will increase your dexterity and sacrifice some of your arcane, so your status effects will be a little bit less effective than they would be normally, but it boosts your damage significantly. So I highly recommend that one if you're playing Deep of Night on Scholar, to get more damage out of your melee attacks and things like that, and to give you like a broader variety of weapons that you can use effectively. All in all, with Scholar, your rotation should look something like get into combat, use any items as necessary if you need to like buff your teammates. If you have the relic that puts items on yourself and teammates, buff them with damage reduction or stamina recovery or whatever, healing, whatever it is you want to do. Then use Analyze as quickly as possible. I usually start off debuffing the boss if it's like a harder hitting boss, and then once I've debuffed the boss, then I will try and put in a status effect, and then I will back away and ideally buff my teammates in front of me. Hopefully both of them are there, but if not, then at least one ally will buff, and then kind of rinse and repeat between every time my character skills off cooldown, debuff the boss, buff teammates, debuff the boss, buff teammates, something like that. I only do this for really challenging bosses most of the time, because I find that because you can proc so much stat effects so easily, it's actually faster. Like if it's an easy boss, if everyone's just guns blazing in and you're going to try and trigger bleed, like rip off health real quick with it, or frostbite and bleed, just chunks of health missing, goes faster that way. But when you're fighting tougher bosses, end of day bosses, Night Lord, etc., you're going to kind of shift into that rotation of debuff, buff in between cooldowns. You'll try and apply status effects and maybe use something like the Wreath Calling Bell or a ranged weapon if you have a bow, something like that. So I hope that helps with Scholar. Scholar is a very fun class to play. It has a very high skill ceiling and a very high skill floor, in my opinion. And it's definitely not a class for everyone. Not everyone wants to pull out their binoculars or whatever and analyze like every 5 out of every 10 seconds or something like that, or 4 out of every 10 seconds. That's definitely not for everyone. If you find yourself not using Analyze at all playing Scholar and you're just running in and attacking because you like triggering statuses, you might want to switch to like Duchess or maybe even Executor, because they can apply statuses really well and they're not going to sit there and use Analyze. Because Analyze is a huge part of playing this class, and if you don't use it, you're just doing yourself and your team a disservice. So that wraps up my guide on Scholar. If there are other tips out there for things I didn't mention, absolutely mention them in the comments. There is a lot to this class. I don't think I covered every single detail of it, but I got a lot of it. I got the bulk of it out of the way. But if there are other things that you know of that you could recommend, please leave them in the comments to help out other players.